Hi, welcome to my first podcast in my Edgar Allan Poe podcast series. Today, we will go over the major events in Edgar Allan Poe's life, and then in the next couple, we'll transition into um, his work, The Raven, and context about The Raven, and also the reception of it. But for right now, let's focus on specifically his life. Starting with tragedy. Edgar Allan Poe was born on January 19th, 1809, in Boston, Massachusetts. Unfortunately, right after he was born, both his father and his mother died. That's actually extremely tragic. Um, and fortunately enough, a neighboring family named the Allens were able to take in Edgar and his siblings and cared for them for a long time. A journeyman. So now living with his new family, I guess, or his step family, Edgar's stepfather had business around the world. So they went from Boston, Massachusetts to Irvine, Scotland, to Chelsea, London, then to back to Richmond, Virginia in 1820. And the thing was, this is an interesting childhood to have, especially back then when travel wasn't as common, especially like traveling all over the world, just because it's a lot of money and also the technology, right? So having a unique kind of worldly upbringing definitely spilled over into some of his work. And was definitely something interesting that needed to be included. Another interesting fact was that when he was 13, or he had written enough poetry, some people say, by the age of 13 to where he could have created a book. So that kind of signifies that sometime during his childhood, he started writing poetry. His teenage life and life at university. So when he was 16, after they came back to Richmond, Virginia from traveling, he fell in love with his neighbor, Sarah Royster. And what was really interesting about this is, look, Edgar Allan Poe, he is very relatable, right? Like he's just like the rest of us. He experienced lots of experiences that we can all relate to. And one of those being that having a teenage relationship or teenage love. Like there's tons of teenagers today that can relate to that. And also, before going off to college, he had to basically break up with her or couldn't see her anymore, lost contact, right? And that's also a similar experience for like thousands of teenagers across the country before they go off to college. They might have to break up with their girlfriend. And so it's just interesting how, even in his life back then, he was still experiencing similar experiences to people today. So now he's at university. He was a good student. He was elected to the Jefferson Literary and Debating Society. And also, he graduated with top honors in Latin. He didn't graduate, but he got top honors and was high achieving in French and Latin classes, right? So for social life, he had a decent group of friends, and they would gather in his room, and he'd tell them the stories and recite the stories and the poems that he'd write. So that was interesting. Also, another fact was they found this letter that he wrote to his stepfather, where he was complaining about exams and having to study a lot. So again, that just goes back to the relatability factor where, look, he experienced experiences that college students, including myself right now, are experiencing, having to study for exams, being a little bit fatigued by that, right? So he wrote that in a letter to his father, and that was definitely a relatable experience. And then lastly, his time at university did not end the way he wanted to, or the way most people would have expected. Um, his father gave him $2,000 worth of allowance a week, and I think it paid for school and also other necessary, you know, lit products and things that he used to live, right? But he gambled that 2,000 away pretty much every single week. Like he would gamble heavily, and eventually he just got into $2,000 worth of debt. Um, so, or he didn't get 2,000 a week. My fault, excuse me. But he probably got a lot less. However, eventually he gambled, and it became $2,000 worth of debt. So his father did not want to pay that debt, and he had to withdraw from university. So now that he's back at home with his father, right? They start feuding. So he decides to have a brief, like, kind of stint in the military where he joined the military under the name Edgar A. Perry and lied about his age and said he was 22. Um, Basically, while he was at the military or in the military, his father, stepfather, told him that he was cut out of the family inheritance. And basically, that caused him to have extremely bad behavior, and he was released by the military. The important thing is that he actually released some poems, including the one Tamerlane, and those started circulating while he was in the military. Finally, the next chapter. So he finally can just clean his hands of his stepfather for the most part, and and his stepmother ended up dying as well. So it was mostly just him and his stepfather, especially when that whole period when he was in the military. So now he can probably just move forward and live the way, or at least live a different life, or kind of be out of his stepfather's grasp, right? So he moves in with his aunt in Baltimore from 1832 to 1835. What was interesting about this arrangement was his cousin Virginia also lived in the house, and he ended up falling in love with her and secretly marrying her in 1835. And yes, she was 13, and that actually was based off my research, even young for back then. But my understanding is she consented to it, and they ended up having a good relationship. So that was definitely an interesting fact. And so while he moves to Baltimore, or while he's living in Baltimore with his aunt, his writing career starts to take off. He wins this prize, this $50 prize from this contest that this newspaper was having for his story, MS Found in a Bottle. And then eventually he becomes the editor for Southern Literary Messenger until 1837, and then he became an editor assistant at Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, where he wrote The Fall of the House of the Usher. And that was one of his best works. So that definitely was, got him to notoriety, but locally, right? And then also another big piece that got him kind of local notoriety was the murders of the Rue Morgue. And we learned about this piece in class. And this was really the first modern detective story, right? And he's credited with kind of creating that genre. And so that piece was definitely an important one and helped move his writing career to a new height. So finally, the climax, right? The climax was when he moved to New York, and while he was there, the New York Evening Mirror published his poem, The Raven. Remember that name, The Raven. That is an extremely famous poem that he wrote, probably his most famous one, and he became famous overnight from it. Unfortunately, he only made $9 actually at the time. because I think he didn't really have the rights to the poem, or the bulk of the money went to the newspaper. But yeah, at least he got the notoriety, um, and became famous overnight. So in 1847, his wife Virginia died from tuberculosis. And why that's on this slide with the raven is because Poe's mood completely changed. He became pretty much depressed, and slot and kind of you know went into alcoholism, or leaned on alcohol as a crutch to try to subdue his feelings. And it relates to the Raven because a lot of people suspect that those last 5 years before she died, when she was just sick, a lot of those years kind of represent, or were the inspiration for his poem, The Raven. Lastly, Poe's death. So it's kind of interesting the way he died, or kind of a mystery. So he, after Virginia, his wife, died, he returned to Richmond and he agreed to marry his teenage love, Sarah, right? And basically 10 days before they were going to marry each other, he was found back in the streets of Baltimore, and he was high, and really delusional and wearing somebody else's clothes pretty much. And it was important to note that that was on election day. So a lot of people suspect there's a couple theories, right? There's this thing called coupon, where on election day, apparently people will get kidnapped and drugged, and they dress that person up to act like multiple people, so that person can vote multiple times, right? So that's one theory. Another theory is that he got rabies, and then a third theory is that he might have committed suicide because, again, he was just in a dark place after his wife Virginia died. So again, it's a mystery how he died, but definitely kind of an interesting ending, and adds to his kind of persona and story. Lastly, the themes of his life. His life, there was tragedy and death, love, family issues, traveling in worldly experience, addiction, and then also, he didn't know exactly what he wanted to do. Like, he flip-flopped around to it and was to a lot of different places, and was, obviously in the military, was a student, then eventually became a writer. He didn't know right away. So that's also another theme. And the reason why I mention these themes spill over into his writing, and these themes are like the main reason why his writing is really relatable, and I think famous, because people can definitely get behind it and can understand what he's saying in terms of being able to relate to it. These are my sources. Okay, that's it. I'll see you in the next one.